The first thing that you always got to point out when State of the Union address comes up is that it's completely meaningless and it's boring. And if you want a good night's sleep, just turn on the State of the Union address and it'll put you to sleep really, really fast. But this one was a little bit more interesting, in my opinion, because essentially what was going on was Joe Biden ranting and screaming incoherently towards everybody and not being able to make a coherent sentence, not because he was too senile to make the points, it's because he was just so filled with rage and anger. And it was kind of in that regard a little entertaining to watch, but just like any State of the Union address, it's always filled with nonsense. And at this point, it's basically just turned into a campaign speech for Joe Biden.
There's been speculation on the internet whether he was actually sober during this State of the Union, whether he was taking prescription pills. Because, I mean, there wasn't as much stuttering as he usually does, but it definitely seemed kind of wild and crazy throughout the State of the Union. But also, I want to mention a couple things about it. You know, how State of the Union addresses used to be more like. It used to be more cohesive and a vision for the future of America. And it seemed like throughout the entire State of the Union, his messaging was pretty much just attacking either Republicans in Congress or Americans, period. You know, whether it was Ukraine or, you know, January 6th, continuously calling it the worst event since the Civil War. I mean, that was pretty wild. Or with his mistake with calling Lincoln Riley, the head coach of USC football. I don't know how you make that mistake. But there's just a lot of things throughout the State of the Union that just don't really resonate with a bunch of Americans, like you said, and as actually an attack on a lot of Americans.
Yeah, so it's very similar to what his State of the Union address was the first year he came in office, where it was just him being angry and him ranting and hating on half the country, the people that voted for Donald Trump or that are members of the Republican Party. It was basically just him trashing them, calling them horrible racists and things like that. And this was no different than that. The example that you were giving about the mispronouncing the Lincoln Riley name is the bill that is being proposed right now that is supposed to force criminalization of illegal aliens that committed theft. But that bill has been brought up because the murder of a woman named Lincoln Riley. And then at one point, because people were shouting at him, particularly Marjorie Taylor Greene was shouting at Joe Biden. He then pulls the pin and then holds it, and then even then mispronounces the woman's name, calling her Lincoln Riley, even though he's holding the pin in his hands while he's saying that. Which, Biden, you couldn't turn for 2 seconds just to read the name?
Lincoln Riley, an innocent young woman who was killed by an illegal. That's right. But how many of thousands of people being killed by illegals?
Yeah. And, you know, also, you know, talking about Lincoln Riley, not Lincoln Riley, Joe Biden, but there was an interview afterwards with MSNBC he had, and the interviewer, I mean, they didn't really ask him about making a mistake with the name, but the only thing he called Joe Biden out on was the fact that he called the perpetrator an illegal immigrant instead of a undocumented immigrant.
Response to her heckling of you used the word illegal when talking about the man who allegedly killed Lincoln Riley.
An undocumented person. And I shouldn't have used illegal.
Like, really, the rhetoric in this situation matters when, you know, you kill an innocent person. And we could talk about, you know, his remarks on border crisis, specifically the fact that he's saying he proposed the strongest border bill of any president, which is obviously false. I mean, we just saw recently that over 300,000 refugees refugees is a strong word, but, you know, illegal immigrants were let in on a helicopter secretly without any mention from authorities. No one really knew about it. So he didn't really mention that in his State of the Union, but he's trying to negate from the fact that he did do some horrible things with the border.
Interest of the Biden administration is not this woman that was killed by an illegal immigrant. And even during the State of the Union address, as soon as Joe Biden mispronounces her name, he then says, but how many illegal aliens die every year from, or how many people die every year from illegal aliens? The answer is way more than they should be. And it's been under his watch and under his administration where there's been more illegal immigrants entering into America than ever before. But then the point about the interview you bring up is that the whole point of the thing that the media and that the Democratic Party thought was so appalling was the fact that he used the term illegal alien and not undocumented worker, or undocumented person, which is no longer the correct term, by the way, anymore. It is now a newcomer. That is the new appropriate term that you call the people entering into your country.
But if you really look at it, I mean, it just doesn't seem like, the Democratic Party really want to win this election. I mean, yeah, Biden obviously is just, reading off the prompt they give him in the State of the Union address. He's not really bringing up any cohesive arguments. But when you mention all these things with the border crisis, which we know it was a complete falsehood, what he did, him mentioning it actually is probably ruining his chances in the election more so than him not even mentioning it at all. But also when he's first thing he mentioned in the State of the Union address was Ukraine, a thing that completely divided Americans in terms of the response to it. But it's not just that. It was January 6th when, like Cooper said, continuously attacking Americans. He's talking about specific issues that are so divided in America that this was his one chance to bring up something that can actually bring Americans together and actually help in the election. But he's mentioning things that just divide people more and more, and it's just going to affect his chances coming in November.
The problem is that he is placating to the ultra left-wing basis of his party. That's it. He is completely ignoring any moderate or independent people because there are legitimate issues that are bipartisan amongst Americans. And Joe Biden is taking the extreme against all of those things, whether it be funding Ukraine to some extent, funding Israel to some extent, abortion, things like that. Joe Biden takes the extreme and the radical positions of each of those issues, and it is alienating the moderates of America. And we've been seeing lately that the polls have been indicating that Joe Biden is in some serious trouble, where in almost every major poll, if you look at the RealClearPolitics polling averages, Joe Biden is down by a lot in a lot of major polls. And that's not even taking into consideration the little percentages of the Trump voters that don't accurately are represented in the polls. And they're always underrepresented, where in 2016 and then also in 2020, Donald Trump always overperforms the polling averages. And that's very similar the case to be happening in 2024, except he's winning in all these polls. He's up by 1 point or by 2 points. And so in actuality, he's probably up by 4 or 5 points in many of these states.
Yeah, it was interesting you said that because, I was looking at RealClearPolitics and it was mentioning the polls on Michigan and Pennsylvania, which perhaps are actually probably one of the most important things you could look at in terms of polls, because the Sun Belts have always been between Democrats and Republicans. And for a long time, the Democrats won because Democrats had the working class vote in terms of people, working class communities in these places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio, all these different types of places within the Midwest. But now you see from the polling data, it seems like Trump is winning in these areas, which is very critical as a voting base.
And part of the strategy of the left has been to repeat the same kind of groups that they were able to coalesce together back in 2012, where Barack Obama was able to get a huge portion of minority voters and women and educated white people mostly. And then they built this coalition that they thought was undefeatable. But now that doesn't really work with any other candidate besides Barack Obama. And so didn't work with Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton was the most unlikable candidate ever. And it's not working with Joe Biden because he's just this old dude that is turning out to be a really bad president. It's his own policies that are at fault with that. But he doesn't have the same charisma to bring that kind of coalition together. And so he needs those moderate independent voters to be able to win the election. He can't do it just on these extreme coalitions. And so there's a lot of that news going around about him placating towards the Palestinian Michigan voters because he's so worried about losing that state. Well, he should be more concerned about losing the support from the most Americans who are actually in favor of supporting Israel over Palestine and over Hamas. that is a fairly large portion of the United States is actually in support of Israel. And so the fact that he's alienating those is actually going to hurt him way more in the long run.
On to that point, I think time is right. Time is really going down in order for Democrats to make a change, because I think the only way they could even win an election was to have a new candidate. I think at this point they needed to go younger with a guy like Gavin Newsom to actually even appeal to a new voters, because everyone knows what's going on with Biden. I think American voters are really starting to see that he's really mentally not there. And, on top of all these different things he's trying to do to conform to his ideology and his party and dividing Americans, and all these different types of things that, it's not really helping him in the future, but actually affecting him horribly. But I think it's a time for us to stop. And, it's great talking to you, Cooper. And I hope, if you guys like us, if you like us talking about this every week, just make sure to subscribe and make sure to give us a thumbs up. It was great talking to you, Cooper.